Hey, welcome everyone to today's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. You may remember a few months ago we had someone on who was about to make an argument on behalf of a citizens group against some of the efforts done by the governor of New York State. Guess what? She was successful. She's going to tell us all about it on this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. As always, it's brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Linden Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there and welcome everyone. Don't you like the way I look this week? Yeah, I'm doing it all for you. I'm making it look really special. Here we go. No, we don't want that. This is what we want.
Edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each
This has just been an incredible episode, prepping for it, getting ready. About everything has gone wrong that could go wrong. You don't see the half of it. But me and Bobbie do, though. So with us, you may recognize this face. This is Bobbie Anne Cox. She represents New York Uniting New York State, NYS. And she has made a case that she argued successfully a few months ago. Bobbie, why don't you just start off by telling us again what that case was about, who was behind it, and who you were arguing against?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me on again, Chris. I appreciate it. So, my name's Bobbie Anne Cox. I'm an attorney here in New York State. I've been practicing for about 25 years. And earlier this year, I brought a lawsuit against Governor Hochul, her Department of Health, the Health Planning Council, and the Commissioner of Health, Dr. Mary Bassett. And the lawsuit was about a regulation that they had passed, the Department of Health had passed, which was called Isolation and Quarantine Procedures. It was found at 10 NYCRR 2.13. And basically that regulation allowed the Department of Health to pick and choose which New Yorkers they could lock up or lock down. Now they could have locked you down in your home, or they could have removed you from your home and they could have locked you up in a facility of their choosing. There was no time frame on that, so they could have locked you up for days, for months, for years. I mean, there was absolutely no restriction. There was also no restriction on age. So they could have done this to you, but they also could have done this to your child or your grandchild or your elderly grandparent. So this regulation also allowed them to use local law enforcement to enforce their orders. So you could have gotten a knock on the door from either the sheriff or the local police saying, I'm sorry, you need to come with me. We have an order of isolation or quarantine from the Department of Health. And what was really also pretty amazing about this was that they didn't have to prove that you were actually sick. They didn't have to prove you were even exposed to a communicable disease. They just had to suspect. Maybe you were exposed, maybe you weren't. They didn't have to prove anything. And yet they had this amazing power that they gave themselves to pick and choose which New Yorkers they were going to lock up or lock down. So basically, I heard about this regulation, and together with a group of New York State legislators, I'm representing Senator George Borrello, Assemblyman Chris Tague, Assemblyman Mike Lawler, together with a citizens group called Uniting New York State. And together we sued the governor and the Department of Health, and we won.
Well, tell us a little bit about how long this process took, and both in terms of when you made your arguments, how long that took, and then how long deliberations took, and then how did you feel after you got that verdict?
Yeah, of course. So we first filed the lawsuit at the very beginning of April, and the case it was rather contentious. The first thing that the governor did was remove our case from state court because we filed in New York State Supreme Court in Cattaraugus County. She removed the case, or the Attorney General, who's representing the governor, Attorney General Letitia James, her office removed the case to federal court. And they tried to make it a federal case, which it clearly is not. This is all about New York State law and New York State regulations. So we had to fight to get from federal court back into state court. And for that, I actually had to call on a colleague of mine who's based in the Albany area. His name is Tom Marcel. He is a town court judge, and he's also a practicing attorney. Actually, he's now running for New York State Supreme Court, Tom Marcel. So he helped me because he's admitted in the federal court where they removed. I'm admitted in a different federal court down in Southern New York. So we did have to do motion practice. We had to do oral arguments in front of the federal judge. He ruled in our favor, and he sent the case back down to state court. And then the next thing you know, the Attorney General is fighting us on the amicus brief, because there was an amicus brief that was authored by Assemblyman Andy Goodell. He is also an attorney, and he is from Chautauqua County. So he made this amicus brief, brilliant, really fantastic brief, and it was signed on to also by Assemblyman Joseph Giglio and Assemblyman Will Barkley. And the Attorney General's office fought us, and they tried to keep that brief out of court. They did not want the judge to read it. They did not want the judge to be able to consider it. So we had to do motion practice back and forth over that. And ultimately we did win that motion, and the judge did allow the amicus brief into court. And so we had oral arguments on this case back in the end of May. And then it took about, I'd say about 6 weeks for the judge to issue his ruling. So it was on July 8th that he ruled in our favor, and he struck down the regulation. He said it's a breach of separation of powers. The governor and the Department of Health do not have the power to make this kind of a regulation. He said that the regulation conflicted with existing New York state law, which was one of our arguments. Because here in New York, we have law. It's Section 2120 of the Public Health Law. We already have law that actually does say what you do if you want to remove someone from society because they are a public health threat. The difference is that that law has many due process protections built into it so that there's no abuse by the government. Whereas, Kathy Hochul and her Department of Health, they come along, they make this regulation that has no due process whatsoever. And it was a horrible situation because, if you allow a government agency to make a regulation that conflicts with existing New York state law or conflicts with our Constitution, now you've got a branch of government, the executive branch, completely out of control, right? All three branches of government are supposed to be equal. But if one of them, in this case, the executive branch, is allowed to make a reg that conflicts with law, which comes from the legislative branch, that's tyranny. That's taking power that you don't have, and that's elevating yourself above the other two branches of law and two branches of government. And that's not permitted. That's a violation of the Constitution.
So how did you react when you first heard? Were you surprised? Did you expect it? Was it something that you were on pins and needles about? Give us this point of view, because a lot of people often wonder, they watch sporting events, so they see how their teams do, good or bad, and they're always kind of nervous about the outcome of a game. Is it similar to when you're arguing a case in court?
Yeah, I would say it's similar. So you try to get a feel for how it's going when you are arguing a case. You can understand from the questions that the judge is asking you, if the judge is understanding your argument and following you. And in this case, when we were doing oral arguments, the Attorney General was making an argument. The judge asked point blank, he asked the Attorney General's office, if you take a family and you put them into isolation or quarantine, let's say you put them into a facility, a hospital. The judge asked them, he said, well, how do they get out? And there was a really pregnant pause on the part of the Attorney General's office. And then finally, the Assistant Attorney General said, well, I guess they could hire a lawyer and they could sue. So in essence, he was saying the government had the power with this regulation to pull you out of your house, put you into a facility or a detention center or a hospital, isolate you, and you had no way to get out, right? Hiring a lawyer and trying to sue your way out, that's ridiculous. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. Lawsuits take a lot of time. Lawsuits take a lot of money because they take so much time. So that's completely ridiculous. Due process means that you have protections built into a regulation or a law, which makes sure that the government doesn't abuse its power before they start injuring the citizens. And this regulation had no due process at all. In fact, the judge's decision, he said, this regulation gave lip service to due process, meaning there wasn't any actual due process built in there. So I was thrilled when I read the decision. It was the right decision. It was a solid decision. And, unfortunately, the Attorney General has filed a notice of appeal. So now they want to use our tax dollars to fight an appeal.
Well, you anticipated my next question, which is how did they respond? And so they're going to go for an appeal. Well, let me ask this. Let's say this is purely hypothetical. Well, first of all, how long would it take for an appeal to be accepted? That's a quick question before I ask my next one.
So the appeal does have a time frame. They filed their notice of appeal the middle of July. Technically, they only have a couple months to perfect that appeal, but it doesn't get completely thrown out until several months later. So this pushes them past the election, which I think is a big issue because, they filed that notice of appeal, but they haven't actually pursued the appeal yet. And I'm pretty sure they're doing that. They're stalling because I think that they don't want voters to know that they want to appeal this decision and try and get that power back. I personally think if New York voters knew that the governor and the Attorney General, Letitia James, want to have quarantine camps in New York State with no due process, no way to get out once you've been thrown in there, no proof needed that you're even sick or exposed to a disease. I think if the voters knew that, they would vote these two people out of office in a heartbeat. So I think they haven't pursued the appeal because I think they don't want voters to know what their plan is.
Well, let's talk about a hypothetical. Let's say one or the other loses the election, and I don't know. Does it matter if one or the other loses? Does one have the power of appeal, or are they both allowed to appeal? What kind of solution could be coming from the voting booth in a couple of weeks?
Right. So Kathy Hochul is running against Lee Zeldin. So Lee Zeldin is the Republican candidate. Let's say that Zeldin wins and Hochul loses. If Zeldin does not want to pursue this appeal, then he could tell his Attorney General, whichever person that is, because on the side for Attorney General, we have Letitia James, who's the Democrat. She's the current Attorney General, who wants to pursue the appeal. She already filed the papers. And then you have Michael Henry, who's the attorney that's running against her, and he's on the Republican ticket. And so if you have Lee Zeldin winning as governor and you have Michael Henry winning as Attorney General, I'm confident there won't be an appeal. I have spoken with Lee Zeldin about this topic. He is absolutely not in favor of unconstitutional quarantine camps. And so I know that they would not go forward with an appeal. If Lee Zeldin doesn't win, but Michael Henry does win, and now he's the Attorney General, I do not believe he would move forward with the appeal from conversations and just what he stands for and what he's been saying on his campaign trail. And then if we have the situation that both Kathy Hochul wins governor and Letitia James wins as the attorney general, I'm confident that they will appeal this and they will try and get that power back, because they have made it very clear that they believe that they should have the power to put people into quarantine camps without any sort of due process at all.
One more combination. What if Zeldin wins and Letitia James wins? Can the governor tell the attorney general not to pursue it, or can the attorney general appeal it on her own prerogative?
Yeah, I mean, the attorney general could pursue, it doesn't really follow that she would have to listen to Zeldin if he's the governor. But politically speaking, if you have the governor saying not to do something and coming out publicly and saying not to do something, and then you have an attorney general that does it anyway, it's really bad optics. So,
well, plus, isn't this an executive order to begin with?
No, the quarantine regulation was actually a regulation issued through the Department of Health.
Through the executive department, though. So what I'm getting at is that if the chief executive, in this case Zeldin, tells the regulatory body underneath him, no, we're not going to go with that regulation, isn't that the final say in it?
Oh, so yes, the governor does control who is heading up agencies, right? So the governor's the head of the executive branch, as you said, and then all of these agencies like the Department of Health, the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, those are all agencies under the governor in the executive branch of government. So the governor does get to appoint the heads of those agencies. So the governor can appoint who heads up the Department of Health, who heads up the Department of Education, and so on. So if you have a commissioner of health under Zeldin, and the commissioner of health wants to issue a regulation which is completely unconstitutional, like this quarantine one was, you really wouldn't see that, because the governor is in charge of the executive branch. And those commissioners, for example, the commissioner of health right now, Dr. Mary Bassett, she was appointed by Hochul, and she sits at the pleasure of the governor. So the commissioner is going to carry out the agenda of the governor. That just makes sense, because they're not elected officials. Whoever's in the departments, whether it's Department of Health, Department of Transportation, or whatnot, those are not elected officials. They're unelected. They're just appointed bureaucrats.
We're running a little long in this segment, so let's take a break for commercial, and we'll be back to talk more about this and maybe some things at the federal level that are similar. Be right back.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken, but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back, everybody. We've got Bobbie Anne Cox. She's with Uniting NYS, and she's been telling us about a very successful court case that she's had and some of the repercussions. And we're going to return to that for a moment. But let's talk about some of the similarities that you've seen going on at the federal level with laws and not necessarily laws, but with regulations like these. Can you expand on those and to tell our listeners maybe what they could see from the federal level, like what they've been seeing from the New York State level?
Yes, absolutely. The government overreach that's going on from the executive branch is just tremendous. We've seen it here in New York State with Kathy Hochul. but we've also seen it at the federal level with Biden. If you recall, so last summer, the CDC, the United States Supreme Court had struck down a regulation that the CDC had issued, and that was the moratorium on evictions. So the CDC basically said across the country, no landlords could evict their tenants for non-payment of rent in the name of COVID, right? Somehow evicting a tenant spreads COVID. So they were sued. It went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And last summer, the Supreme Court ruled and said, no, the CDC does not have the power to make a regulation that says that landlords can't evict their tenants. The CDC is not Congress. It's not a legislative branch. It's an agency under Biden. So it's under the executive in the executive branch. And the executive branch doesn't have the power to make laws. That is something that's reserved for the legislative branch. So another example that we saw was last year, the Biden's OSHA, which is another agency that's under the executive branch. OSHA made a regulation that said all employers in the United States with 100 or more employees had to force those employees to get the COVID shot. Otherwise, they had to come to work masked and they had to test weekly and so on. So they were sued. The case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And in January 2022, the Supreme Court struck that down and said, no, OSHA does not have the power to make law. And that really was a law. OSHA was stepping into the lane of Congress, which is the legislative branch, and they were trying to make a regulation which really was a law. So the United States Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. Then we saw just this summer, we saw another instance where the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, also an agency under Biden in the executive branch, they made a regulation that said basically it conflicted with existing federal Clean Air Act law. And they tried to make this regulation that was going to put limits on air pollution from certain facilities in a certain industry. And they were sued. It went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, sorry, EPA, you are an agency. You are not Congress. You are not in the legislative branch of government. You don't have the power to make a law. And really, that regulation was a law. It was they were trying to change existing federal law through making a regulation. So it was struck down by SCOTUS and it was deemed unconstitutional. And so here we see this pattern of the executive branch, again, not just here in New York State, but also at the federal level. And they're just doing what they want to do, even if they know they don't have the power to do it. They're doing what they want to do. And their attitude is, catch me if you can, right? Which then, we can't sustain our democracy in such a situation. We need leaders at the top who are going to follow the rules and stay in their lane. Otherwise, we have to keep suing, and lawsuits take time. Lawsuits take money. It's a dilemma.
We had a question in from a member of the audience that asked, I don't know if you know this or if you know the answer to this question, but how similar is this, what you're talking about, this executive overreach, and the law about voting that was just struck down? I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, and the person didn't put it down. Something to do, was it with the mail-in ballots or something that they restricted, the courts restricted on what the New York State wanted to do? Are you familiar with that? I might be totally going off base.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of rulings recently, but one of them was about mail ballots. I believe another one was about voting early and counting the votes early. But yes, what we're seeing, that's another example. What we're seeing is executive branch agencies or just the executive branch themselves, Hochul herself, are doing things that they're not supposed to do, not allowed to do. The whole thing with the changing the voting rules and such, the Constitution, the federal Constitution, says that elections will be run by the states, and each state can set their own rules and laws about elections. So that means that the state legislature can make laws to help, promote, this is how we're going to structure our elections, this is how they're going to run. But that doesn't mean that the legislature can just do whatever they want. Those laws that they make about voting, for example, in this instance, have to be constitutional. They have to follow, the checks and balances of the Constitution. So yes, when you see either the executive branch, or in this example that you're bringing up, the legislative branch, doing something that they're not supposed to do according to the Constitution, you do have to bring a lawsuit to get them back into check, because they're not going to voluntarily give up the power, right? Governments don't typically take power from people or take power from another branch of the government and then voluntarily just give it back. So it does end up that you have to fight it out in court, which is unfortunate, because it's an extreme waste of taxpayer dollars, because the government fights back on these cases, and then when they lose the case, like in the instance of my quarantine camp regulation, they lost that case. Now they want to fight on an appeal, and they're using our tax dollars to do it. It's terrible.
So we have a few more minutes left, and before I want to give you time to talk about the event that's coming up, and also tell people how they can get more information about your group. But before we do that, you've just, in my mind, you kind of perked some curiosity. If you were, say, on the other side that you're fighting, tell us more about this strategy of not following the laws and forcing your opponents to sue you. Why is this an attractive strategy? Why is it successful, or why has been successful, really, maybe until just recently with your court case, but it seems like it's very compelling. Tell us a little bit more about that from a strategic standpoint.
Well, it makes sense from their side, because if you think about it, if a government actor, in this case, the governor herself, the Department of Health, which responds to or is underneath the governor, if they want to do something, they just do it. And then they think, well, even if we're not supposed to do this, the only way we're going to get stopped is if somebody brings a lawsuit. And in the case with this quarantine camp regulation, we saw this very clearly. There was a bill that was proposed, a proposed law that was proposed for 7 years, starting in 2015, straight through the end of 2021. It was proposed by Assemblyman Nick Perry. He was a Democrat from Brooklyn. He's no longer in the assembly. He's now, Biden appointed him to be the ambassador to Jamaica. But he had this bill, which was very similar to the regulation that I struck down. It was, same type of thing. The governor, the Department of Health, they could pick and choose which New Yorkers to lock up or lock down. There was no due process and so on. So basically, that bill failed for 7 years. It never became a law because it had no support. Literally, not one other assembly member got behind the bill, and not one senator got behind the bill. So that bill had zero support for 7 years. So what happens? Well, the executive branch sees that and says, well, you know what? We want that power. We want to be able to put people into quarantine facilities with no due process, with no proof that they're even sick. So the governor takes that language, tweaks it a little bit, and then makes it a regulation coming through her Department of Health. So now you basically have a proposed law that failed for years is actually becoming the rule of the land, because the governor just changed the language and made it a regulation issued through an agency. That's very dangerous. That right there is a clear breach of separation of powers. The governor isn't allowed to do something that the legislature doesn't even want to do just because the governor feels like doing it. This is not a monarchy.
You're talking in terms of political theory, which I totally understand. I'm thinking of in terms of game theory. So what you're describing is a situation where there is virtually zero downside for the actor. Zero down. They might not get their way, but that's just status quo. So there's zero downside with some probability of upside, getting what they want without following the rules. In other words, they could win a case. And
Correct.
So the question that I have, and we're going to go a little bit longer because I want to pursue this just a tad more. The question I have is, other than losing an election, because I don't think losing an election, in my mind, is sufficient downside for bad action in office, is there a reasonable downside that could be introduced? And kind of what I'm thinking of is in the parliamentary kind of way of doing things. If a prime minister loses votes or whatever, they're forced to be recalled or get reelected or resign. We just saw that in England now. What would it take to put some sort of punishment for these bad actions that would really introduce a kind of downside in game theory that would dissuade elected officials from circumventing the law like this?
Well, thinking on a legal level, really, it would have to come from the legislature. The New York State legislature would have to create a law that says, if the executive branch does XYZ and in bad faith, but I don't see something like that happening, because there would definitely be constitutional challenges to that. Who's the legislative branch to tell, the executive what to do, and how do you determine what's overreach and what's not? So I don't think that there would be that type of legislation. But if you think about it, what's supposed to happen is that the executive branch and the legislative branch, I mean, all branches of government, are supposed to follow the Constitution. We have a Constitution already, and the Constitution says very clearly that we have three branches of government. Whether we're talking about the federal or we're talking about the state of New York Constitution, it's the same premise. We have three branches of government: executive, which is the governor and her agencies. Then you've got judicial, which is the courts and the judges. And then you've got the legislative, which is the senators and the assembly members. So each of those three has their own defined powers. And if one of those takes the power of another branch, that's tyranny. That's a clear breach of separation of powers. So you want to have in place already, in those powerful positions in the government, you want people who understand the Constitution and honor the Constitution. If you think about it, our Constitution was written by our founding fathers. It's not a perfect document, but it's a brilliant document. The reason that it's brilliant is because our founding fathers came from tyranny. They were living under a king in England. They were living here on our land, and they had no representation. They had no voice. They were just subject to the edicts and the whims of the king, right? Who lived nowhere near them and didn't understand what their needs were and their wants and such. So, they broke free and started our country. And when they did that, they wrote our Constitution. And in their minds, when they were writing it, was, we want to try and make sure that that type of tyranny never happens again on these shores. And yet, here we are almost 250 years later, and we're fighting tyranny. And it's because the Constitution is not being upheld.
So I think I would tend to agree with you when it comes to the United States Constitution. But remember, the New York State Constitution was written before that. It may have even been written before the Articles of Confederation, which was the first federal attempt at a constitution that didn't work. And so that's a digression. Let's go back to what we were talking about in terms of downside. So you're saying that one branch may violate their constitutional vows. Is there an existing process in New York State to impeach somebody who violates the New York State Constitution?
I don't know that there are impeachment procedures possible for a breach of the Constitution like that. But, it's quite honestly, we do need to have people in power. I really do believe in the power of vote, because if New Yorkers knew what the current government is doing behind their backs, I do not think that they would keep this current government in place. The Democrats have a supermajority in both houses, in the New York State Senate and the New York State Assembly, and they have the governor's mansion right now. So if you think about it, for the past couple of years that they have had these supermajorities, New Yorkers need to ask themselves, before they go to the polls on November 8th, how is my life? Am I stressed out? Am I struggling to pay my bills? Do I feel safe? How is the economy doing? Can I put food on the table for my family? Can I heat my home? Can I put gas in my car? People need to really stop, look around themselves, and take notice, because if you feel that we're going in the wrong direction, you need to change the leadership. We have a really big election on November 8th. Not only is Governor Hochul running for election against Lee Zeldin, but we have the Attorney General up for election. So Letitia James is up against Michael Henry. And we have all the New York State Senate seats are up for election. We have all the New York State Assembly seats are up for election. We have the federal level as well. We have Congress seats open, and we have federal Senate seats open. So we really have a huge opportunity in New York on November 8th. We could wipe the slate clean and put in there politicians or candidates who really do honor the Constitution. I'm a firm believer, if Lee Zeldin, for example, the Republican candidate for governor, if Lee Zeldin wins, he has been on the campaign trail saying he would not do these things, these government overreach, reaching into the legislative branch. He would not be doing mandates. He would not be doing quarantine camps. He's been very clear on this. People need to do their homework. They need to see, a lot of people don't even know who their state senator or who their state assembly member is. People need to look that up. Do your homework before you go to the polls, because November 8th is going to be a huge opportunity for us in New York to get some constitutionally conscious, as I call them, legislators and governor and attorney general. Your life is going to be much better if we have people in there who are following the Constitution. Like I said, it's not a perfect document, but it is brilliant. The three powers, the three branches of government have to stay within their own powers. Otherwise, it's the people who suffer.
Well, let's go back. Oh, there you go, back on the screen there. I want to give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about the event that you have coming up and how people can find out more about the group.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So this Saturday, the 29th of October, we're going to be hosting an event in Elba. So it's just outside Rochester, outside Buffalo. And basically, it's going to be myself, and it's going to be also Senator George Borrello, who's the lead plaintiff on this quarantine lawsuit. And we're going to be giving speeches, and we're also going to have other speakers. Assemblyman Dave DiPietro is going to be coming, perhaps Assemblyman Steve Hawley, Mayor Deb Rogers from Williamsville. And we're going to basically be discussing, giving details about the quarantine regulation, our lawsuit, our win, probability of appeal, what happens if it's appealed, what happens if it's overturned. We're going to go through all of that on Saturday. And we're going to also be covering some other issues, some bills that are proposed right now in the New York State Assembly and the Senate, which are pretty scary bills that we want to raise awareness about for the voters. So people can get more information about the event on Saturday, and you can register at www.unitingnys.com. And if you just click on the button there that says fundraiser, we are trying to raise funds. I've been doing this case pro bono all year, so we are trying to raise funds to help defray the cost of this lawsuit. So you can register there online, and if you can't make it in person, you can also register for a Zoom link, and we'll send you a Zoom link, and you can follow and take part in the afternoon via Zoom. So that's this Saturday, the 29th, starting at 1 p.m. in person in Elba. And if people can't make that and you just want to check out the lawsuit and see the details about the quarantine lawsuit, you can go to www.unitingnys.com/lawsuit. And that page is specifically about the case. There are videos there. There are flyers people can download and post on their social media to help raise awareness about this. We have photographs. We have a 2-minute commercial posted on there. And just ways people can get involved. And so if people want to get involved, please check that out. Tons of information there. And we do really need people to step up and help spread the word, because the mainstream media is not picking up this story. So,
well, thank you very much, Bobbie Anne. And I'd like to remind everybody that if you do want to be a member of the live audience where you could ask questions, then go to our site, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. Sign up for free, and you'll be notified every Thursday morning when the show airs. The show airs Thursdays at noon live, and then it's not rebroadcast. It is archived on our site, so you can see it immediately after. If you want to see the re-airing, and in fact, if you're watching the rebroadcast now, it's Sunday at 1:30 on our Facebook page. If you like that page, you'll be notified when it's broadcast. If you prefer YouTube, 1:30, same time, Sunday. When it's broadcast, you'll be notified there. The problem with waiting for the rebroadcast is you're going to miss the Saturday event. So every so often, we have something like this that in between the live presentation and the rebroadcast, an event occurs. So there's an advantage to either watching it live on Thursdays or going to the site soon after that live broadcast to see it there. Well, Bobbie Anne, thank you again very much for being here with us today, taking the time to do that. And we'll see everybody next week. Bye-bye for now.
thank you, Chris.